Welcome to the panel on Wolfram Alpha. My name is Chen Chang Zai, or you can just call me Chen. I'm a faculty member of the computer science department here, and I also have a joint appointment at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. So Wolfram Alpha is ambitious and breakthrough innovation in search engine technology, but I just learned from the panelists that we shouldn't call it a search engine. We'll know more about this. Anyway. But it goes beyond the search engine to actually compute knowledge. So it's a knowledge computation engine. Like search engines, you can ask Wolfram Alpha questions in the form of a keyword or natural language query. But unlike conventional web search engines that typically return a list of pages to you, Wolfram Alpha would actually give you answers to your questions directly. And more than that, if the answers don't exist on the web, it would know how to compute the answer based on the data on the web. So it's really much more intelligent than any other search engine. Okay. So today, we're lucky to have 3 contributors of Wolfram Alpha to join us to talk about it. And they are Jing Bach, who is sitting on front there. And Jing has been in charge of developing the content management module of the software, and Theo Gray, who is sitting next here, and he has made a number of important contributions, especially in the context of Mathematica, which is the basis of Wolfram Alpha, and Stephen Wolfram, who is joining us from Boston through teleconferencing. Okay. Hi, Stephen.
Hi there.
Okay. So, so Stephen is the founder and the CEO of Wolfram Research, and he has been in charge of the development of both Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha. So the format of the panel is the same as the previous one. So the panelists will talk for about 1 hour. And then I have to stop to if this goes longer then. And then after that, it's 30 minutes for question answering. So now, without further ado, so I turn it over to the panelists. So I think Jing is going to speak first.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Zai. I'm delighted to be here today to represent Wolfram Alpha and to be a part of this program. The university and the community has certainly been involved with many important events in the history of computing, and I'm very proud to see Wolfram Alpha being recognized for continuing this kind of illustrious tradition. It's a real honor, and on behalf of all of us working on Wolfram Alpha, I'd like to thank the sponsors and organizers for this distinction. As a side note, I am also a proud alumnus of the Graduate School of Library and Information Science, also known as GSLIS. And I'm personally quite pleased to see that this event is being jointly sponsored by the Library School as well as the Computer Science Department, along with the Vice Chancellor's Office for Public Engagement. It's this kind of collaboration that I personally see as pivotal to the future of library and information science. And as far as I'm concerned, Wolfram Alpha is a prime example of the synergy that happens when computer science and library science comes together. So getting back to Wolfram Alpha, where did it come from? How did it get conceived? How did our company take on the audacious task of curating all of the world's data and presenting it in one unified, computable environment? Well, it's a very interesting story. The first thing I want to tell you about is that this is far from the first venture into public computing by Wolfram Research. And it's far from it, actually. So what I consider our first public information effort came in 1990 with a thing we called MathSource. And MathSource was a library of Mathematica notebooks and program files that our users could search and download using things like FTP and Gopher and WAIS, if you all remember those words. We also offered an upload mechanism so people from our community could add to the library. So other public sites followed. We unveiled our very innovative integrator site in 1996. This site, which is still very popular with students, solves indefinite integrals. You put one in, we give you the answer. In 1998, we established the Math World website. And Math World is a comprehensive math encyclopedia, which as of today contains over 13,000 entries. Our mathematical function site debuted in 2000, and this site now has over 300,000 formulas and 10,000 visualizations, all available to anybody that's interested in mathematical special functions. In 2006, we established the Wolfram demonstration site, and it now has over 6,000 interactive visualizations of concepts in math, science, engineering, and more. All of these sites are free to anybody. And I'm happy to say that I've been rather closely involved with each of these pioneering public sites. Each of them in some way has contributed to the development of Wolfram Alpha, but the complete story of how these predecessors, along with our core Mathematica technologies, led to Wolfram Alpha can only be fully told by one person, the man who conceived of each of these sites, as well as Mathematica himself, Stephen Wolfram. So, over to you, Stephen.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I'm pleased to be here today, even if in somewhat virtual form. You know, in a month, it will be exactly a year since we were 2 miles away from where you are right now, doing this. If you can see the display, it was quite tense. It was the culmination of about 5 years of work and 25 more years of previous development. We were going to launch Wolfram Alpha, which was an absurdly ambitious project that I hadn't been sure was going to be possible at all. I mean, our long-term goal was and is to make all the world's systematic knowledge computable, to take all the data and models and methods that our civilization has accumulated and set it up so that it can immediately be used to compute answers to whatever questions people ask. Well, there's a long history to this basic idea. I mean, Leibniz was talking about a version of it 300 years ago, and 50 years ago, when computers were young, it seemed like it wouldn't be long before something like this was possible. But people mostly thought that it would happen by computers managing to somehow emulate brains and sort of pulling in knowledge and processing things like we humans do. Well, I myself am right now 50 years old, and as perhaps I'll show you later, I'd actually been thinking about sort of globally systematizing knowledge since I was a kid. It was about 30 years ago when I first started thinking about sort of making knowledge broadly computable. And at that time, I concluded it would require sort of solving the whole problem of artificial intelligence and was something that was really way out of reach. But then I spent the next 25 years doing things which, as I'll explain, finally made me think maybe, just maybe, this computable knowledge idea isn't so out of reach. So I must say that at first, I still didn't know if it was only not out of reach in a 50-year type of time frame, or 20 years, or 5 years. But I decided we should at least give it a try. And 11 months ago today, all the work we put in was concentrated in this control room about 2 miles from here. So it all started with some abstract intellectual ideas, and now in the end, it had turned into millions of lines of code and terabytes of data and 10,000 servers that we've just been finishing assembling. Here's the beginning of that process. And some news had come out about our project, so there was a lot of anticipation. And we knew there'd be a big spike in people wanting to try out what we'd done. So we'd obviously done lots of testing, but we really didn't have any idea what would happen when millions of people actually started accessing our system. But we thought, let's let as many people as possible sort of share the experience of finding that out. So we decided to do a live webcast of the moment when we actually made our system live to the world. Well, actually, the day of the event, I was thinking, this is going to be incredibly boring TV. All that's going to happen is that at some moment we'll push a virtual button, everything will go live. Well, needless to say, it did not stay boring long. I mean, early in the day, we had finally finished assembling all of our servers, and we were able to start switching them on. And oh my gosh, lots of stuff didn't work. Well, at the appointed time, we started our live webcast, and still things weren't working. And there was some horrible networking and load balancing problem. We'd advertised 9 p.m. Central Time as our go live time. We figured that on Friday evening, most people wouldn't be thinking about us, so we'd have a comparatively soft launch. Well, with perhaps 15 minutes to go, we'd finally solved the main technical problem. But you know, when we'd been sort of designing our whole sort of control room setup, people had said when you look at other people's control rooms, you see that they often have television news and television weather and things playing. And so perhaps we should have that too. Well, I said, "Bah, we don't need that. This is just a computer kind of thing. We don't care if it's raining or anything like that." Well, fortunately, we actually did have pretty good weather and news feeds because this event was happening in May in the Midwest. And as it turned out, with perhaps 30 minutes to go, that there was another problem. And we can actually look at a live Wolfram Alpha to find out what was happening there. Let's see if we can do that. Let's go to Wolfram Alpha here, and let's go and ask it what the weather was like in Champaign on May 15th, 2009. And let's see if it can compute that. Okay, well, let's scroll down here. So most of the time, the average was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. But if we look down here, we will see this very strange spike there in the precipitation rate, right around 8 p.m. And in fact, down here, we can look at the wind speed. And down there, just around 8 p.m., there's this big spike that goes up to 50 miles an hour. Well, so what's that giant spike in wind speed just after 8 p.m.? It was a tornado approaching our location. Well, we had backup generators. Of course, we had several remote co-location sites for our servers, but still we had a tornado coming straight for us. Well, fortunately, at the last minute, it turned away, and the power didn't even go out. At I think it was 9:33 p.m. and 50 seconds Central Time on May 15th, we were actually able to officially press the button and make Wolfram Alpha live. And our giant project was launched, at least out of the starting gate. Well, I thought I would talk a little bit here about the background of how we got there, and how it was, for example, that we were 2 miles away from here in Champaign, Illinois. Well, the story actually goes back a long way. When I was a kid growing up in England in the 1960s, and at first I'd been really into the space program, but by the time I was 10 or 11 or so, I decided that actually physics was really where it was at. So I started teaching myself physics, and pretty quickly started reading college physics textbooks and so on. And in the summer of 1972, when I was 12 years old, I happened to get this particular book. Oh, whoops. Well, you can see. Let's go back to the top. There. And I got really interested in the foundations of thermodynamics and statistical physics, and in reproducing the process that was shown on the cover of this book. Well, it so happened that I was about to get my hands at that time for the first time on a computer. So a teacher at the high school that I went to, a school called Eton, had been a friend of Alan Turing's. And through that, he had gotten connected to computers. And somehow a decade and a half later, he'd managed to get the school given a computer. It was a thing called an Elliott 903C, and it was about the size of a large desk. It had 8,000 words of 18-bit core memory, and it was programmed with a paper tape. Well, I started programming that machine, and my top goal was to reproduce this physics process on the book cover. And in the process of doing that, I learned quite a bit about programming. I think probably my finest achievement was a paper tape loader for which I had to invent some kind of error-correcting code. But for my physics simulation, I actually invented something kind of neat too. I invented a simple kind of computational system that, although I didn't know it at the time, is called a cellular automaton. Well, a decade later, I made a lot of interesting discoveries using cellular automata. But back in 1973, as luck would have it, the particular cellular automaton that I investigated just managed to avoid any of the interesting phenomena that I saw later. I sometimes wonder whether I would actually have recognized those phenomena for what they were back in 1973. In any case, I went on to other problems, and in particular got very involved in particle physics and quantum field theory and so on. Well, one feature of those areas is that they're full of very, very complicated algebraic computations. And which I have to say that I, as a human, was not particularly good at. And that might have been a sort of disqualifying handicap. But what I realized was that actually I didn't need to do all this algebra. I could just get a computer to do it instead. And in 1976, I started ramping up to eventually become probably the world's largest user of the various algebraic computing systems that had been developed at that time. It was kind of fun. I would write a paper where I would say, from this one can calculate, and then give some incredibly complicated formula. Well, I could always tell when people were reading my papers, because I'd get these questions, how exactly did you derive formula number such and such? You must be so good at doing algebra. No, I said, I just got a computer to do it. I'm not sure in those days that people actually believed me. But anyway, by 1979, I had pretty much outgrown all the systems that had been developed so far. And so a few months after my 20th birthday and a couple of weeks after I'd gotten my physics PhD at Caltech, I decided that my best option was just to build my own computational system. So I remember going to the Caltech bookstore and buying all of the available books on computer science at the time. And wasn't actually that big a pile. And over the next few weeks, sort of systematically going through reading them. So I wanted to make a very general system. So I kind of operated a bit like a physicist, thinking about different kinds of computations I thought I might someday want to do, and trying to figure out what underlying building blocks, what primitives they could be built from. And what I came up with was what I now call symbolic programming. And I assembled a team and started implementing the system in what was then the newfangled language C. Well, then, almost exactly 30 years ago today, the system first came alive. This is not its first moment, but it's an example of SMP. The system was called SMP, the Symbolic Manipulation Program, and at that time it was born. So I realized, of course, that the system wasn't just useful to me, but potentially lots of other people, at least if they had access to one of the big mini-computers of the time. And in 1981, the system was to the point where it could really be released. Well, I was by then a young faculty member in physics at Caltech, and I didn't really know anything about business, but I eventually backed into the realization that the only way to really give the system I was building its best chance was to start a company to develop it. Well, in those days, universities were pretty confused about spin-off companies, and I got caught in the middle of some fairly spectacular confusion. But the company did get started. A side effect was that I quit my job at Caltech and moved to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which had the interesting feature that in von Neumann's time, it had effectively given away the computer. So it really felt okay about not trying to own technology that people developed there. Well, particularly during the time of confusion with Caltech, I decided, what the hell, let me just do a project that's fun. So at first I thought about trying to do something related to sort of extending my SMP project and trying to make a computer that would do, computer system that would sort of do brain-like things. But somehow that morphed into a version of my pre-teen interest of trying to understand how it is that complex things can happen anywhere in the universe, in brains or cosmology or whatever else. Well, at first I thought that about all sorts of complicated models for that. But then I decided to just sort of start simple. I think it was the experience that I had in developing SMP. I kind of wondered, just like I can make primitives for a computer language, can I make primitives for how nature works? So I started looking at the very simplest possible programs, not like typical computer programs we write that are complicated things that we construct for particular purposes, more like naturally occurring programs, really simple ones that might sort of arise at random. Well, here was the big experiment that I did. This is it in kind of line printer form from 1982. And here it is in modern Mathematica form. And the big point here is that although many of these simple cellular automaton programs just do very simple things, there are these amazing examples where one just starts from a simple seed and follows a simple rule and gets all this amazing stuff. Well, suffice it to say that this picture is I think, the single most surprising discovery that I've ever made. I had the intuition that one gets from engineering and so on, that to make something complicated, one had to use complicated rules and go to lots of effort and so on. But here was an example where just a really simple rule could produce all sorts of complexity. Well, in nature we see lots of complexity, and the exciting thing was that this example seemed like it finally showed the secret that nature uses to make that complexity. Just by sort of sampling programs out there in the computational universe of possible simple programs. Well, I thought this was pretty exciting, and that this whole idea of simple rules producing complex behavior should lead to a very interesting new area of science. Well, I did lots of work in this direction myself, and I pulled in quite a few other people as well. But I thought what's really needed was a whole army to really start conquering this area of science. Well, by this point, partly as a result of starting the company around SMP, I'd begun to think that I wasn't completely hopeless as an organizer of things. So I decided I should try to launch this area of science that I called complex systems research. So I wrote up manifestos for the science and went around telling people what a good idea the science was. I started a journal for the science, which was actually the very first fully computer-produced journal in any area, and that in fact I still publish today, 25 years later. And I wanted to start some kind of institute for the science too. And I think I was pretty businesslike about it. I sort of wrote up a plan and went around effectively getting bids from a bunch of universities. Well, so what happened, as you might guess, is that the University of Illinois won. And so with the lead taken by the physics department and with support from NCSA and connections to computer science and math departments, in the fall of 1986, I came to Illinois to start the Center for Complex Systems Research. I'm happy to say that the university did well in living up to its promises, and CCSR got off to a good start, and I think we recruited quite a lot of interesting people to Illinois. But one bug I realized is that when you have a new direction in science, there aren't really, right off the bat, many professor-level people who do it. So it was really hard to fully staff up. And I must admit that I realized that at age 27, I was not completely cut out to be a university administrator. So in the fall of 1986, very soon after I'd actually come to Illinois, I started thinking about sort of other ways to move my science and my objectives forward. So I was a bit impatient with the general development of complex systems theory, or complexity theory as it's later more often called. CCSR at Illinois was the very first complexity institute. Today there are hundreds of complexity institutes. But back in 1986, I thought it would seemed like it would take forever for all the funding and organizational structure to build up. And what was building up was, I thought, too mushy and not really pursuing the most interesting basic science. Well, so my first idea had been get lots of other people into doing science that I think is good. But soon after arriving in Illinois, I hatched kind of plan B. Build the absolutely best tools I can and put myself in the best personal situation I can, and then try to push forward on the science myself as fast as possible. Well, by that time, the SMP company had wandered off in other directions, and I had largely detached from it. In the mid-1990s, actually, after many adventures, it actually went public, only to be gobbled up by a series of bigger fishes. But so I decided that I needed to build a new, more general computational system, and that I needed to start and run a company to do that. And that was how Mathematica and Wolfram Research got started, right there in Champaign, Illinois. At first, of course, it was a tiny operation, but in an amazingly short time, basically only 18 months, we got to the point of having a first version of Mathematica. And through other things I had done, I was by then quite connected into the computer industry and so on, and so we were able to start making various deals and things. And on June 23rd, 1988, in Santa Clara, California, we officially released version 1 of Mathematica. And very quickly, we started to grow our company in Champaign. By 1991, we were developing a substantial and broadening customer base, and we were able to release version 2 of Mathematica. And it was great to see our R&D and our company growing so well. But I think perhaps what I was most excited about was that I had a really great tool to use for myself. So in mid-1991, just after the release of that's something, it's a lovely chime, but it's probably not relevant.
What does that mean?
It was very loud there. It was right next to a microphone. So anyway, in mid-1991, just after the release of Mathematica, 2002, I decided that I would go away for a little while and push forward on the science that I'd been doing. So I used technology to become a remote CEO, first in California, then in Chicago, later on, much later in Boston. And meanwhile, I was using Mathematica to discover some really incredible things. And the year or so that I had expected to spend doing that stretched into nearly 11 years. But finally, in 2002, I finished wrapping up all the science that I had figured out into a big book. And NKS, as the field that's based on the book is usually called, has a lot of important implications in science and ways of thinking about things and in technology. Well, in the time I'd been writing the book, we'd built up a terrific team at Wolfram Research, and lots of things have been achieved. We've been pouring algorithms and capabilities into Mathematica, but more important, we'd slowly been realizing that the fundamental ideas of Mathematica were capable of supporting vastly more. It's funny, really. I mean, one builds some kind of paradigm, then one lives in it for perhaps a decade, and then one starts to understand what the real significance of it actually is. Well, that's the way it was with Mathematica. We had the idea of having this really unified system built on the principle that sort of anything could be represented as a symbolic expression. And at first, we knew that algorithmic formal kinds of things could be represented that way, mathematical kinds of things, things about data, things about geometry or graphics. And we knew that all these things could be manipulated in a very uniform way by the operations in our symbolic language. Well, by the mid-1990s, we realized that things about documents could also be represented that way, and that we could build up symbolic documents to present things. We'd long been wondering whether interactive user interfaces could also be unified into all of this, and gradually we realized how to do this. And after about 10 years of work, on May 1st, 2007, we finally released a completely reinvented version of Mathematica that included this idea of dynamic interactivity. Well, it's been exciting to watch the progress of Mathematica. In a sense, my idea with it was to use it to sort of automate as much as possible, to take everything about computation that we humans don't need to do and to make it happen automatically. Mathematica has all these algorithms inside, but the notion is that when we use it, we shouldn't have to think about those. We should just have to think about the problem that we're trying to solve, and then Mathematica should automatically figure out what algorithms to use. And should also automatically figure out things like how to present a plot of a result, or how to set up a document or a user interface. We want to automate as much as possible. We want to have everything in the system as coherent and unified as possible. Well, if you keep building and building with those principles, you steadily build up something pretty interesting. And in the past few years, we've really been having a blast. We've had a pretty simple objective. The idea is, let's just implement everything. All algorithms, all forms of computation. And because of the automation and unification of the system, one gets this very interesting sort of recursive process. Any one new piece of functionality can kind of, for free, make use of sort of arbitrarily sophisticated stuff from elsewhere. So it gets easier and easier to build things. Well, the result of this, if one plots the number of functions in Mathematica as a function of time, one can see this rather fine increase that I think is going to go up again in the next year or so. Perhaps because of its name, people think of Mathematica as being something that's sort of about math. Well, of course, we pride ourselves on our achievements in automating mathematics, but by now, math is just a small part of what Mathematica does. It used to be the case that we'd think about just sort of adding new functions to Mathematica. Now we think about adding whole giant subsystems that sort of each might be the complete work of several large independent software systems. Well, so things with Mathematica were going really well. We had a nice, profitable private company based here in Champaign for many years. We'd always been interested in sort of sharing and communicating. As Gene mentioned, even before the web, we had this thing called MathSource with all kinds of elaborate mechanisms for submitting and sharing material. And we had grand plans for sort of communicating by email, for getting documents by fax in response to automated phone calls, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then the web came along, and we started doing things with that. In 1996, we put online the Integrator, a site for doing integrals. And over the years, it's done billions and billions of integrals. The numbers go up and down in different calculus seasons and so on. Then in 1998, we put online Math World. a huge repository of mathematical information. In 2000, we launched our mathematical functions website with more than 100,000 formulas. And then later on, we launched our whole demonstrations project. Of course, really though, our biggest knowledge base and knowledge repository was Mathematica itself. I mean, for years and years, we've been pouring all those algorithms and all that formal knowledge into Mathematica and extended its language to be able to represent the concepts that were involved. Well, while I'd been working on the NKS book, I sort of kept on thinking, what will be the first killer app of this new kind of science that I'm developing? Well, when one goes out into the computational universe, one finds all these little programs that do these amazing things. And it's a little like doing technology with materials, where one goes out into the physical world and finds materials and then realizes they're useful for different things. Well, it's the same with those programs out in the computational universe. There's a program there that's great for random sequence generation, another one for compression, another one for representing Boolean algebra, another one for evaluating some kind of mathematical function. And actually, over the years, more and more of the algorithms we add to Mathematica were actually not engineered step by step, but were instead just sort of found as a whole by searching the computational universe. One day, I expect that methodology will actually be the single dominant one in engineering, and that will be the real sort of mega killer industry of NKS. But back in 2003, I was thinking about the first single killer app for NKS. And I started thinking back to my whole idea of computable knowledge, of making the world's knowledge computable. We'd obviously achieved a lot in making formal knowledge computable with Mathematica, but I wondered about sort of all the other knowledge, sort of systematic knowledge, but knowledge about all these messy details of the world. Well, I got to thinking, if we believe the paradigm and the discoveries of NKS, then all this complicated knowledge should somehow have simple rules associated with it. It should somehow be possible to do a finite project that can capture it, that'll make all that systematic knowledge computable. Well, it was clear that this still wasn't a small project, and I didn't know if it was a doable project. Of course, it helped that we had Mathematica, and which was an incredibly productive language to be able to write things in, and a great practical platform for deploying things. But still, there were many things that could go wrong. I mean, there could just be too much knowledge, too much data in the world. It might not be possible to curate it in any reasonable way. Or there might be too many different models and methods to implement, with everything having to be separately built for every tiny subspecialty. Or another huge problem, maybe one can get all this knowledge into the system, but we humans wouldn't be able to communicate with the system. With Mathematica, we could define a formal language for interfacing with the system and interacting with it. But when it comes to all systematic knowledge, that's too big. People would never be able to learn such a formal language. Really, the only way we can expect people to interact is using the language that they all know, human natural language, English or whatever. So we have to solve the problem of getting the system to understand that. Well, of course, people have been trying to get computers to understand natural language for nearly 50 years, and it's been notoriously difficult. So that might have been another place our project would have just turned out to be impossible. I really didn't know if the first decade of the 21st century would be the time we could really first build a computational knowledge engine, or whether I was off by a decade or 5 decades. But still, around 2004, I decided it was worth a try. We had Mathematica to actually build the thing. We had NKS as a paradigm for seeing what to do. And we had a great company with the resources to take on a potentially impossible project like this. Perhaps even more important, we had people who knew about all the different areas that would be needed in the project, from building large-scale server systems to creating linguistic algorithms to the details of zillions of particular content specialties. So we've gradually been collecting at the company, both here in Champaign and scattered around the world, a wonderful, eclectic collection of very talented people who were used to working together, combining very different talents on very diverse projects. Well, the first thing that we did in thinking about our computable knowledge system was to work on data. Could we take data on all sorts of things in the world and curate it to the point where it was clean enough to compute with? We started on things like countries and chemicals and also on things like polyhedra. And we actually at first built what we call data packlets for Mathematica. You see, in Mathematica, you can compute the values of all sorts of mathematical functions and so on. But we wanted to make it so that there'd be a function that, say, computes the GDP of a country by using our curated collection of data. Well, we did lots of development on this, and in 2007, when we released our reinvention of Mathematica, it included lots of data packlets covering a variety of areas. Well, that was a great experience, and in doing that, we were really ramping up our data curation system, where we take in data from all sorts of sources, sometimes in real time, and clean it to the point where it's reliably computable. Well, I know there's library school people here today, so I should say that yes, good source identification really is absolutely crucial to this process. These days, we have a giant network of data source providers that we interact with, and actually almost none of our data comes now, sort of just comes raw from the web. It's typically from primary sources, but even once we have the raw data, then what we found is that we've only done perhaps 5% of the work. What comes next is organizing it, figuring out all its conventions and units and definitions, figuring out how it connects to other data, figuring out what algorithms and methods can be based on it. Another thing we found is that to get the right answer, there always has to be a domain expert involved. Fortunately, at our company, we have experts in a remarkably wide range of areas, and through Mathematica, particularly its very widespread use in sort of frontline R&D, we have access to world experts in almost anything, who have been incredibly helpful to us. Well, anyway, in 2007, we had released our first computable data in Mathematica. Meanwhile, we were busily constructing what would become Wolfram Alpha. In the past, one might have thought that what we were doing would need sort of having a whole artificial intelligence or something. But in a sense, we were cheating. Like if we needed to solve a physics problem, we weren't going to have our system reason its way through that problem like a human would. We were going to just have it set up the equations and then just sort of blast through to the answer using the best modern mathematical physics. In a sense, the usual AI approach would have been to think a little bit like people imagine one had to do in the Middle Ages, to sort of figure everything out by logic. But we were going to leverage on the 300 or so years of development in science and so on, and just use the very best possible modern methods. Of course, it helped that we have Mathematica, so that if we needed to solve a differential equation or figure out some combinatorial optimization problem, well, that was just sort of free. Well, so we set about just implementing all the systematic methods and models and so on from all areas of science and beyond. Pretty soon we racked up 1 million lines of Mathematica code, which is, of course, very, very concentrated compared to code in lower level languages. Then it was 2 million lines. Today, it's actually more than 8 million lines, implementing all those methods and models and so on. Well, then what about the natural language understanding? That might just have been plain impossible. Perhaps what saved us is that the problem we have to solve is sort of the inverse of the problem that people have spent so long on. The usual problem is, here's millions of actual English or whatever sentences. Go understand them. Well, our problem is, there's a certain rather large set of things we can compute about. Now take a look at each human utterance that comes in, then try to understand it and see if one can compute from it. Well, as it happens, I think we made some serious breakthroughs pretty much on the basis of NKS ideas that let us really do things here, sort of taking the stream of undigested human thoughts that people, for example, type into the input field on our website, and having lots of little programs pick away at them, gradually understanding pieces. Well, okay, so the result of that is we can understand the question. We've got data and methods to get answers, and we can compute. But often we can compute lots and lots of different things. So now the problem is to figure out what to actually show as output. Well, here we'd had a lot of experience in Mathematica with what we call computational aesthetics, of automating what to present and how to present it. Well, putting all those things together, we gradually began to build Wolfram Alpha. Of course, then there were practical issues where we're not just going to go to the web to look things up. We're actually computing fresh new answers to every question as soon as it's asked. And that takes quite a bit of CPU power. So we have to assemble a sort of giant supercomputer class cluster and hook it all up, computing pieces of answers in parallel and having Web Mathematica send back the results. Big engineering project. But one that came together that night 11 months ago today, 2 miles from here, when we first let Wolfram Alpha out into the world. Well, it's been exciting to see what's happened. It was really difficult decision, actually, when to actually first release Wolfram Alpha. We'd been adding so much. We knew the system would get better and better, but there came a point when we couldn't really develop the linguistics or even the content without actually seeing how real people would interact with it. And it's been an interesting sort of process of co-evolution, a little bit of evolution on the part of the people, about what to expect, and a lot of evolution on the part of the system, adapting to the foibles of all those humans out there using it. We certainly haven't created an AI, but I think we've done something that's not far off from the science fiction of 50 years ago, and in some respects, we've much exceeded what was expected. certainly in terms of the extent to which we can immediately sort of democratize access to everything through the web, through mobile devices, and so on. Our goal is to provide expert level knowledge to anyone, anywhere, anytime. And it's fun to compare what we're doing with what you see in, say, the Desk Set movie from 1957, which is about a computer taking over the functions of a library and so on, or from our friend Hal from 2001. Now, I suppose that even though we were off by 12 years, we should have made a big effort to launch Wolfram Alpha not from Champaign, but rather from Urbana, just to give a bit of truth to the account of the birth of HAL. But at least we were close. Of course, as well as controlling a spacecraft, there's a bunch HAL can do that Wolfram Alpha can't, at least yet. So we can ask, well, what's going to happen next with Wolfram Alpha? Well, first of all, we're going to continue to grind through more and more areas of knowledge. It's really a never-ending project, but we're getting faster, and we're getting a long way. We're sort of well past most of what's in a typical reference library, I think, and we're going into lots and lots of details in lots of areas, both in current data and in lots of historical data. But beyond adding existing knowledge, we want to start doing things that are more like what HAL might do, actually sort of watching our environment and so on, letting people, say, put an image feed into Wolfram Alpha or upload data from sensors and have Wolfram Alpha use the knowledge it has and the algorithms and methods it has to do things with that. Well, also there's NKS. See, in a sense, right now, Wolfram Alpha is a bit old-fashioned with respect to that. It's using science and so on that's been developed in the past few hundred years. But one of the points of NKS is that you can go out into the computational universe and, in effect, find new creative discoveries almost automatically. So that instead of just using existing methods and models and so on, Wolfram Alpha can potentially discover new ones on the fly, and not just be able to compute, but be able to invent for people. Well, as I mentioned before, my experience has been that once one invents a paradigm, it takes a while to understand what's possible within that paradigm. It was that way with Mathematica and with NKS. It's that way with Wolfram Alpha too. But there's more and more that's coming out. Wolfram Alpha, in a sense, makes possible a new kind of computing, what one can call knowledge-based computing, where we're not just starting from raw bits and algorithms. We're starting from sort of the knowledge of the world and building up computations from that. Well, that changes the economics of lots of things and makes it possible to insert computation in lots of places where it didn't make sense before. And right now, for example, we're figuring out some amazing things about what happens when you combine the precise systematic language of Mathematica with the broad sort of free-form knowledge of Wolfram Alpha. It was, in a sense, very liberating with Wolfram Alpha to take such a different approach to functionality and interface than in Mathematica. They seemed, in a sense, quite incompatible, but now as we sort of bring them together, we see that there's an amazing strength in that diversity. Well, I guess I've spent most of my life now working on very large projects, Mathematica, NKS, now Wolfram Alpha. Each one has been gradually built over a long period of time. And I've worked very hard in each case to ensure that what we're building is really solid with sort of all the pieces that need to be there in place. Well, one consequence of that is that one builds lots of technology along the way that has its own significance. So, for example, from the way we built the interface to Mathematica, we've ended up now with a very interesting other thing, computable documents that we'll be releasing on a large scale later this year. You know, I was thinking about Wolfram Alpha and about the long chain of circumstances that have led us to be able to build it. I knew I'd been toying with things a bit like Wolfram Alpha for a very long time. I happened to have my 50th birthday last year, and for that I was looking at a bunch of archived material that I have, and I started looking at these things that I created when I was about 12 years old, and I realized something quite shocking, that there with sort of typewriter and ink pen were collections of sort of knowledge set up to be as organized as I could make them then, a sort of non-computer pre-Wolfram Alpha. Well, of course, when I found that, I started typing things in from what I'd done when I was 12, and yes, the modern Wolfram Alpha did get the numbers right and so on. But I realized in some sense that I was probably fated for nearly 40 years to build a Wolfram Alpha. But what's really nice is that things sort of came together to the point where we could actually do it. So now we're off and running with this giant project, and I should probably I'm gonna pretty much wrap up here. It's great to be part of this celebration of 50 years of public computing in Illinois, and I'll be pleased if I'm lucky enough to be able to come to the 100-year version of this. The projects that we're doing still won't be finished then. Some of what will happen with them we can readily foresee, but some, as we sort of build out these new paradigms, will be as seemingly unexpected, I think, as Wolfram Alpha has been. Until we look back and sort of see that, can see that the seeds of those projects were already sowed today. And if we'd been just a little bit smarter today, we would have been able to see what would come next. Okay, well, I'm going to stop here and let's turn this over to our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. So we now have plenty of time for question answering. If you have a question, please come to the microphone. And Jing and Theo will come to the front.
This question is posed to you as a, I guess, librarian and coming from a librarian. What is a typical day of a content manager like?
Meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. I've got two of my content managers here. No, I have my two main content managers here today. Dushyant Makmala and Alan Joyce. And Dushyant is in charge of science medicine right now. It's only a small field. And Alan is in charge of socioeconomic data. So what they do is meet with our programmers and our developers, one after another usually, and go through all the different projects we have going on. Of course, there's usually 10 projects any one day that need attention that we're reviewing to see how the project's going, how we want to display our outputs, how the data is lining up, etc.
I guess I need to know in more micro level, what is the project?
So when Stephen was talking about data packlets, that's one of our main frameworks. It's not the only one in Wolfram Alpha, but it's one of the main ones, and that's a collection of data about a particular subject area. So one of the things we're working on right now, Alan's working with religion data, doing, statistical information about, what percentage of different denominations are represented in each country, stuff like that. Dushyant is working on a project right now related to global climate studies. And you've probably heard about ClimateGate, right? And that, well, what happened there is you had one set of researchers presenting one set of data. Well, we know that there are over a couple hundred studies that are relevant to global temperature change over time. And so what we're doing is taking a slightly different approach than, we're going to show you all of them. You make up your own mind about, what the data shows you.
Maybe I could try taking a little bit of a discussion of sort of what the workflow is in putting something into Wolfram Alpha, particularly a data kind of thing. So, the first step is there's all this knowledge out there in the world. What should Wolfram Alpha know about? Well, there's some basis for thinking about that. You just go to a reference library, you go look at almanacs, reference books, these kinds of things, and you see, what are all the sections in these books? What have people chosen to put in before? That's sort of one basis for having an idea of sort of where are the interesting places to look for knowledge. But by now we have, in a sense, a much more accurate source. We have hundreds of millions, billions of queries that have come into Wolfram Alpha, most of which we were able to deal with, but some of which we couldn't deal with. And when we look at the ones that we couldn't deal with, those are our to-do list, effectively, that tell us what areas we should be tackling. So in a sense, the pre-step to working on data curation is the triage of all of the, what we call fall-throughs, the things that don't work in Wolfram Alpha, all of the zillions of feedback comments that come into Wolfram Alpha, So we have a group that works on triaging feedback. We have folks that work on analyzing and clustering fall-throughs. So we want to know, of all these millions of things that didn't work, how are they clustered into different areas of human knowledge? And so, for example, one trick that we use sometimes there is we look at something like Wikipedia. We say there are all these entities in Wikipedia, and we would say in which categories we can then match up the entities in Wikipedia with entities that people are typing in that we don't know about. Then we ask which categories are those entities in, and that allows us to start clustering different kinds of entities and guessing that, well, people are interested in music acts, or people are interested in diseases, whatever else. So sort of the pre-step is identify what areas of knowledge are relevant. The next thing is to say, okay, we've got some area. For example, let's say it's symptoms of diseases. Now we have to say, well, what are the best data sources in the world for that? What are the things that people want to compute from that? Well, let's say it's sunspot numbers, or space weather data, or airplane flight tracking, or whatever else. So then we go and we start investigating data sources, and we have folks whose job is basically to track down the best sources for things. Sometimes we can figure that out in-house. Sometimes we go and we'll ask people around our own company who are experts in things. We have a database within our company called Who Knows What, that's basically a list of, who has a PhD in what subject, who has studied such and such a thing, and so on. That's a place we start. Then we have a network of outside experts, often Mathematica users and things, who we have come to know over the years. And then we also increasingly now just go and find who's the world expert in such and such a thing. Let's just contact them and ask them a bunch of questions. So that's the next step, is kind of getting the right input to identify the best source. Now, sometimes these sources are readily available government sources. Sometimes these sources are hobbyist sources. Sometimes these sources are developed by some academic, some company, whatever else. There's a whole process of source acquisition that we have to go through. Sometimes that takes quite a while. Sometimes it'll be many months between the identification of a source and being ready to start using that source. So the next thing is we've got a source. It's in a database. It's a bunch of spreadsheets. It's plain text. Who knows what it is? Maybe it's even graphs that have to be digitized. All sorts of possibilities. We've got this source. Now what do we do? Well, the first step is to sort of snarf the source into a form where we can potentially use it. Something which has sort of organized data where we can start doing things with it. The next step is that we have to take all that data. We have no idea what its quality is. And I can tell you that every single source we've ever looked at, however well picked over it has been, we found all kinds of glitches in it. And part of the way that we do that is we sort of feed this data into Mathematica. We use lots of visualizations, some statistical techniques, and so on. And we sort of make pictures of things and try to do analysis of things and find all those anomalies in the data. And then we have to say, well, what are these anomalies? Is this data just no good? Is this anomaly something real? And so on. So that's sort of the next step, is kind of setting things up so that we can sort of have confidence in this data. Then the next thing is sometimes the data comes in a real-time feed. There are all kinds of software engineering issues in getting feeds of data coming in reliably, being able to move them out to our co-location sites and so on in an effective way, those kinds of things. And in each different area, there are sort of a variety of different issues that come up. Well, then you have to understand, what really is this data? What are these units these people are using? What are their conventions? How do we understand how this thing that's supposed to be a distance relates to other distances that we have in the system, these kinds of things. So that's a big project. And then usually what happens is that there's raw data, and then there's things people actually want from that data. Like you might have something about diseases, and you have raw data that says, how many patient visits were there per year where people reported this symptom and were diagnosed with this thing. Well, that in itself is maybe quite interesting, but it's not what people really want. They really want something which is some much more derived quantity that's based on that. And as you go up to derive these things, what you realize is that it takes a lot of effort to actually understand the data well enough to do these derivations correctly. Sometimes, for example, the particular one I just was mentioning about disease instances and symptoms and so on, that's actually taken 4 months of hard work to unscramble, with lots of discussions with the original producers of this data, with people academics and so on, who worked on this data, to kind of unscramble just what does this data mean and how can we compute meaningful things from it. So So sort of that's the next step, is how do we derive useful things from this data? How do we not just let people, I don't know, let's say we've got data on some parameters that govern, the stopping of X-rays in matter or something. You don't just want those underlying parameters. You want to say, I've got I've got a gamma ray that comes from the decay of such and such a nucleus. How much lead do I need to shield it? And that requires computing something from that raw data. So that's a big sort of step. There's a thick layer of what do we actually have to compute from the raw data. So that's a lot of work. Then the next thing is, okay, so we've got this stuff that we can compute from the raw data. Now it's a question of what do we present from this raw data? And we have these things we call scanners, which are things that go, given a particular question that's been asked, we say, well, what different pieces of an answer can we produce here? And so then we work on making a scanner that is a good presentation of what people will actually want to know from this data. And that, again, requires lots of expert review and expert interaction, because that's where we get to know kind of what people think is important and so on about a particular kind of area. Another thing we need to do is figure out the linguistics of a particular area. So there might be some entity that was, let's say there's the entity in New York, okay? We have to figure out that there's this other name for New York, the Big Apple. Or we have to figure out in some much more obscure area, something like futures trading, we have to figure out what are all those weird sort of anachronistic things that futures traders use when they refer to different financial instruments. So sometimes we can get that from reference books. We often use Wikipedia, actually. That's one of the places where we really make good use of Wikipedia, is Wikipedia has all this sort of folk information on what things are called. The actual data in Wikipedia doesn't tend to be terribly useful to us because it isn't systematic enough and not really reliable enough. But what Wikipedia is really useful for is to know what's this called, and even not just what's this called in English, what's this called in lots of other languages where there are links from English language Wikipedia pages to foreign language Wikipedia pages and so on. So that's another step, is doing the linguistics for a particular area. So that means both finding alternate names for entities and, more difficultly, finding alternate names for properties of things. In other words, if you say, what's the average traffic delay in a particular city? There's many different ways to ask the question, what's the average traffic delay? How long do people get stuck in traffic each day? What's the congestion in that city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we do a certain amount of automated linguistic discovery from web corpuses and so on. And then we do a bunch of just human work, partly based on our query logs, and partly just based on people who are good with words, figuring out what sort of the different linguistics are. So that's another step, is sort of doing the linguistics in a particular area of data. And then I suppose the final step is sort of the ultimate presentation of things in these scanners, and figuring out how often, let's say we're putting in something about undersea geographic features, okay? Well, you say, well, okay, we've got these coordinates of undersea features. Well, what else do we know that's relevant about undersea features? Well, one of them is, if the thing's 2 miles deep, we have all kinds of physical data about ocean water. And so we know that if the thing's that number of miles deep, we know all the parameters about what the pressure will be, what the temperature will be, all these kinds of things. So that's a useful thing to sort of entrain along with the actual geographic information. Another thing we might know is we have polygons that specify the boundaries of different oceans as defined by the International Hydrographic Organization. And so we can figure out this feature, okay, that feature is in the Bay of Bengal or something, according to the standard polygons and so on. So it's figuring out how these different areas of data sort of connect with each other, and how we can entrain data from one thing to another. And some of that entrainment happens automatically, but we have to kind of hook things into our general frameworks to get that. When we put in a new area of data, hooking things into our general frameworks is a big step. And usually what happens here is that we end up, it's sort of an interesting process, sort of dealing with experts and interviewing experts and so on. And sometimes I get the fun of doing, I don't know whether it's the more difficult ones or just random ones. And usually it's this, okay, we've got to get on the phone with a world expert on some aspect of tree growth, or the world expert on something about earthquakes, or something about economics or whatever. And we want to, as quickly as possible, kind of define some things. You know, how do we think about this data? You know, how do we make up some pithy footnote that will have people not misunderstand what this data is really about, and so on. It's sort of an interesting process trying to, you know, we've I think got a pretty good flow down now for how we ingest this kind of expert input. Please, you had a question.
Yes. If Wolfram alpha can be thought of as a brain, I want to know whose brain is it? In other words, reason has its limits. And if, for example, you take Wikipedia and you look at, say, the Civil War, that's the most contested site. And it isn't about reason as much as it's about interest and the subjective cultural baggage that people bring to the discussion. So we're not looking for an answer that is a consensus of people around reason and bits of knowledge. We're actually talking about contending forces in the world that may speak different languages. They may have fought a war, and therefore their subsequent textbooks in the high schools and their libraries have a completely different account of what happened. So how does Wolfram Alpha as a brain stand apart from these subjective interests that all of us have as baggage and constitute therefore an answer for humanity to solve really fundamental problems?
So I guess one of my fundamental responses to that would be, you know, I actually believe in facts. Not everybody in the world does believe in facts, but I actually believe in facts. Maybe that's because I spent a lot of my time as a scientist where there really are facts. And, you know, sometimes those facts are hard to measure. Sometimes the fact is only that so-and-so measured such and such a result, or so-and-so reported such and such a result. But there are facts. And our goal is really to take all those facts and organize them and make them as computable as possible. Now, you know, you mentioned wars. Okay, we don't have a lot of data about wars yet in Wolfram Alpha. We're just working on that right now. So, you know, you get data about wars, you have casualty figures, you have information about what battles were fought, and so on. And then maybe you have a line that says who won this particular war, right? And you know, that's difficult. And sometimes it's pretty obvious. Sometimes there was a surrender document. You know, that's a fact. Somebody had a surrender document, and that was, you know, something that was produced in this war. Sometimes it's much muddier. You know, I think the best we can do is to kind of report the facts. And sometimes, as I say, a fact can be that, well, what's a good example of that? Maybe Gene or Teo could think of one of these. A place where all we're reporting, yeah, I mean, sometimes we'll be giving, you know, some popularity index for something. That's not really a fact. That's just a statement that somebody, you know, some group of people assign, or for example, a good example is awards, right? You know, best movie of the year. There isn't a, you know, everybody can argue about what was the best movie of the year, but it's a fact that, you know, at the Academy Awards, such and such an award was given for the best movie of the year, and that's what we can report. So I think that's the thing. Now, what I've found surprising and interesting is that there are lots of areas where I didn't think one could compute much at all, where I thought, you know, we'd just be dealing with essentially textual data, and where we'd just be able to say, well, this is an answer. You know, this is a textual answer. For example, things about people, right? You might think there wasn't a lot to compute, but actually there's all kinds of things to compute. I mean, when you, even when you start off with dates, you're producing timelines, you know where people were born, where they died. You know, we know what the weather was like, where the people were, you know, died or were born, if it's in more recent times. Well, for example, with battles, let me give a better example. With battles, you know, it's really nice to be able to know this battle was fought in this place. Okay, what was the weather like, if it's a fairly recent one, what was the weather like that day? If it was even an ancient one, when did the sun rise that morning? What was the phase of the moon that night? You know, was there an eclipse? You know, people say there was some battle that was, you know, in ancient times that was stopped by, you know, an eclipse happening. Well, we know about that eclipse, right? We can figure out, and like, for example, earlier here, I was showing, you know, at the hours when Wolfram Alpha was released, we'd go back and look what was the weather like in Champaign, Illinois at that time. So there are all these kinds of things that to me have been sort of surprising that one can compute. These things that in effect they're at least facts that feed into the description of an event. You know, we can only sort of report the facts, so to speak. That's our goal. Maybe Teo has something. I can't see Teo, so I can't tell what he's doing. But maybe Teo has something to add to this.
Well, I mean, I guess it's always been our policy not to report opinion, but objective facts to the extent that there are objective facts. I wonder if you're also sort of asking a question, though, about whether Alpha is in a position to reach sort of, artificial intelligence-like conclusions that go way beyond the facts that it actually has. Maybe Stephen would like to say something about that, if that was also part of your question.
Well, yeah, it's one thing that's interesting to know. We have all these real-time data feeds coming in to Wolfram Alpha. We know, it's not yet on the site, but we know like the track of every airplane in the U.S. Okay, we know, earthquake feeds we have coming in and so on. And there's a question, you're kind of watching all this stuff that's happening in the world, and you can start making conclusions from it. I mean, we can, we've certainly. One of the things that we can potentially do is effectively automatically detect interesting things that are happening in the world. We have financial data about all sorts of companies and so on. We know where the companies are. We know what, all sorts of things about it. So one of the things that may very well happen is that we may be able to get essentially these signals about interesting things happening in the world that we can sort of deduce because we're watching automatically. I mean, human is not going to be able to watch all of this, whatever it is, gigabytes of data per minute coming in or whatever it ends up being. But we are in a position to do that. And we're in a position to, if we have good algorithms, to sort of pick out where are the interesting things happening. I might say that one of the things we're about to actually launch is the following thing. So we have all this data and, hopefully we hope that as much of it as possible is absolutely correct. But inevitably, when all sorts of things you can look at, there are all kinds of glitches in this data. You look at the I don't know, oil prices as a function of time for some country or some such other thing, or you look at the life expectancy in a country as a function of time, these kinds of things. There are all kinds of glitches. Okay, so what are these glitches, we might ask? Is that glitch in the life expectancy the flu pandemic of 1918, or is it bad data for that year? So one of the things that we've been interested in understanding, how can we get volunteers to really contribute well to Wolfram Alpha. We have a team, a few hundred people ourselves, but we'd really like to be able to sort of do that Web 2.0 thing and harness sort of the interest, and there's lots of interest of people out there in the world for contributing to this kind of project. And so what we've been trying to do, we've had a network of a few hundred volunteers who've helped us with all kinds of things, and it's been great actually. But we're sort of really trying to figure out what are the best places where volunteers can sort of quickly make a good contribution. And we're actually probably going to have a kind of a data challenge where we work towards some particular kinds of data. I think the first one's probably going to be data on not real famous people, but on fictional famous people, and where there's a lot of textual data that's that you can find in books, but where it's not been organized in any way that can be directly used to be computable. And of course, when we have that, we'll be able to know, if you happen to ask about, the future of, I don't know where it is, Iowa or something, in some date in some distant time in the future, it'll tell you, yes, Captain Kirk is supposed to be born on such and such a date there, and all those fun things. Or if you look at some historical time in some other city, it's kind of fun actually. I've learned we recently hooked up for cities in Wolfram Alpha now, because we have all this data on people and we know where they were born and where they died. I hooked up the thing where when you ask about a city, it will also tell you what are some notable people who were born in that city. I was pretty surprised actually by some of the things that I noticed there. Kind of fun to see that. And it's kind of fun to see how all these different areas of data that one probably would just have never bothered. I mean, obviously one could in principle have gone through some book and looked up, who was born in Champaign, Illinois, but you're not going to bother. But now it's kind of an immediate thing that's presented. Well, anyway, so one of the things that we've also been thinking about for volunteers, and I'm kind of curious what people think about this all, is what we might call anomaly discussion. Anomaly, we kind of have a thing we've been developing internally, sort of department of anomalies, where the issue is, what is that glitch? Is that glitch real? Is that glitch associated with some historical event? Or is that glitch something that's sort of unexplainable or might be just a bug in the data? So the idea is to let people contribute, to notice that, yes, there's a glitch in this plot, there's a maximum, there's a minimum, there's a thing where we're looking at the popularity of some name as a function of time, and there's a sudden peak, and you can identify, oh, that was the time when some movie came out that had a character in it with that name and so on. So the idea is, whatever it is, I don't know, whenever it was, we can look it up, 1995 or something, the name Forrest suddenly becomes common because, Forrest Gump, the movie, had come out. So sort of the purpose of the volunteers will be to say, with respect to the name Forrest, in 1995, there's this event, the appearance of the Forrest Gump movie, that might be relevant to it. So this is kind of a place where we're hoping to get outside people to give us. Now, in some cases, there's going to be an opinion that comes up here, because somebody's going to say the reason the economy of such and such a country, cratered, is because so and so was elected president there. And who knows? That may be true. It may not be true. All we're going to sort of present, I think, is something that says, in 1982 or something, in connection with this plot, in 1982, this person was elected president in that country. And, that's just a fact. And the question of whether there's a real causal relationship between that fact and the observation, that's sort of left for the person who's looking at it to decide.
Other questions? I want to take this opportunity also ask a couple of questions. First, from a user's perspective, it seems that Wolfram Alpha and Google can do similar things. For example, I want to find out the weather today in Champaign, and I can use Google to find it, or I can use Wolfram Alpha. So can you say more about what are the major differences between a general search engine and Wolfram Alpha? And also,
Well,
how do you envision the relationship between the two would evolve over time?
Okay, well, I can take some of that, but really the objectives are really fairly different. I mean, a search engine is searching for things. Its goal is to see what's been written down on the web, and to try to say, these keywords that you typed in, do they match something that somebody has written down on the web? Is there knowledge on the web? Is there something on the web that matches this and that I can retrieve and that I can then give you a link to? It's not trying to give you the answer. This is the traditional idea of search engines. I'll say something different in a moment. But the traditional idea of a search engine, as originally sort of conceived, is this thing that goes around the web and forages for things that match your keywords. It has no opinion. The search engine has no opinion of whether this popular page is completely fictional, whether it's incredibly accurate. Just doesn't have an opinion. Doesn't care. Not its issue. Its issue is, I type in these words and be very, very efficient, search billions of pages, and bring back the pages that seem relevant to those words. That's a terrific thing, and there's lots of things you can do that way that are quite different from what you can do with our approach, which is to try and sort of ingest a very organized collection of knowledge and to be able to compute answers to specific questions. So when you look at what people type into Wolfram Alpha, I can tell you that you can ask the question, what fraction of things that people type into Wolfram Alpha can even get non-zero numbers of documents in a search engine? Okay, so you look experimentally at how many millions of queries there are per day, and you say, what fraction of these queries, if you type them into a search engine, would give anything, non-zero number of documents? The answer is only a quite small percentage. The vast majority of queries typed into Wolfram Alpha have never been, they are about things that have never been asked before. They are, particular dollar amounts. They're particular dates. They're particular things, particular combinations of cities and so on. They're about things, they're fresh, new questions that have never been asked before. And that's what we really specialize in answering. If you type in, I don't know, the name of a city or something, you can go and get the Wikipedia page about it. You can get a bunch of other things about it. I think we probably produce some interesting information. We produce some stuff that will be able to tell you, where the sun is in the sky in that city right now, what the weather is like, whether there's been an earthquake nearby recently, all this kind of thing. Now, having said all this, what search engines do is really useful. Lots of people use them. I think what we do is pretty useful. Search engines have existed much longer than we have. And needless to say, there's a great interest in sort of merging what I think are the complementary capabilities of search engines and of the Wolfram Alpha computational knowledge engine. And so, for example, last year we made this deal with Microsoft to have them start including Wolfram Alpha results for Bing queries, and that will get steadily, that sort of integration will get steadily deeper, so that you will be able to go to a search engine like Bing, for example, potentially other search engines as well, and type in a question, and instead of just searching the existing web for the answer to that question, you'll effectively be searching. You won't be searching. You'll be going to compute in Wolfram Alpha what the answer to the question is. Actually, a piece of technology that we've recently developed that's important for that. I mean, I don't know how much people are interested in these technicalities, but one of the big issues is that our engineering parameters are different from search engines. So search engines have a big premium on let's get a result back quickly, even if the result isn't that exciting, and it's just a bunch of links. But let's get something back really quickly. We tend to have the goal of getting back, really nailing the answer, and that takes longer. And so merging those two things from an engineering point of view is a little tricky. And we recently been developing this thing we call a query recognizer, which is a thing that can tell probabilistically very quickly whether a query that's entered is likely to be Wolfram Alpha computable. And it's something, it's an interesting technical problem because we have this very elaborate linguistic analysis in Wolfram Alpha, which takes a while to be sure about whether something is computable or not. And we've sort of had to develop this methodology for sort of approximating the grammars that we have in Wolfram Alpha to do something very fast with this query recognizer, and that's sort of an interesting dynamic. But in terms of what will things look like in the future, Wolfram Alpha technology is being and will over the course of this year become deployed in a huge number of different places, and so including things like search engines. And so when you say what does a search engine do, it will be very confusing because the search engine will do what a search engine normally does, and it will also go to Wolfram Alpha to get answers, Wolfram Alpha type answers. I mean, but it is an interesting statistic, and we've been watching this. What fraction of queries to Wolfram Alpha simply give 0 results in a search engine? In other words, they're things that have never been, that just don't exist on the web, and that's a very large fraction at this point. And actually, that fraction is gradually increasing as people realize that you can ask specific questions. You don't just have to ask, a general bag of keywords and get back things that you get to read for yourself. Please.
Thought that occurs to me, and the question I have is, for example, you've got a weather example up there. I would think that the amount of data available on weather is simply huge, and if all you were collecting was weather data, that you would have your hands full with regard to that. So what are the limits? I mean, if I were going to look for historical weather data, if I was interested in, what the weather was like in the city I was born in on the day
Sure.
I was born.
What was the city you were born in?
Bloomington, Illinois.
And when were you born? Sorry to ask.
July 22nd, 1951. I've just given out so much personal data. Tell me this isn't going
Yeah,
on
I'm
over
sorry.
the
I shouldn't
internet.
have done that, but you asked
Right
for
now,
it.
I'm probably having my identity stolen.
Okay, well, it was a nice day then. Looks like it was a nice day. There's what, okay, I don't know what time of day you were born at, but it looks like it varied between about 70 degrees and went up to 80. It was cloudy that day. This is a good way to test, I've discovered for kids checking out whether their parents were really paying attention when they were born, right? You type this in and you say, what was the weather like that day? So yes, you can work out things like that.
All right, thank you.
But if you're asking, take weather data, for example. Well, I can tell you there is about 5 terabytes of weather data, and that is the complete corpus of publicly available weather data from professional weather stations and from amateur weather stations. There are about 30,000 weather stations in the world. They report on average these days every between 5 and 15 minutes. We get all of that data. We have a feed that gives us all of that data. And we have all the historical weather data that is publicly available. How do we get that? Well, it's complicated. I mean, some of that is quite easy to get. The National Climate Data Center has a whole bunch of it. Some of the amateur data, very conveniently, a friend of mine from high school happened to be the leading collector of amateur weather data in the world. So we were we had a kind of a good source for lots and lots of amateur weather stations and so on. But what's tricky with weather data is this: you're getting a data feed in real time from weather stations. NOAA, for example, goes back 24 hours after the weather data comes in. They go back and they try and validate that a particular weather observation was correct, and they do that by looking at neighboring weather stations and asking what places, whether there's sort of consistency between these neighboring weather stations. But that happens not in real time. And what can happen in real time is that you've got an anemometer spinning around and it's measuring the wind in a particular place, and a bird comes and sits on that anemometer, right? And so it stops, right? And so you record 0 wind speed for that place. So the question is that correct, or is that a data error, and you should be using data from a nearby station instead? And that's something that we're starting to be able to validate some of those things for weather. We haven't finished our efforts in that area. We hope to be able to do real-time validation for weather. Actually, if you look, I don't know why we're talking so much about weather, but let's look for Bloomington, Illinois right now. You'll be able to see there's data on what the conditions are right now, and you'll see there's a forecast for the next few days of what the weather will be like. That forecast is right now coming from the same place everybody gets their forecasts. Okay, it's the work of NOAA. There's actually 2 other forecasts that get produced in the world, one in England and one somewhere else. And this is where every weather site that you ever see, it's the same code that's being run. Actually, the code that's being run computes 12 different predictions for what the weather will be like. And one of the tricky things is aggregating those different predictions and saying, well, there's a 20% chance of rain. What does that mean? It means that some of those 12 weather predictions said there was rain, and some won't say there's rain. So one thing that we're trying to do is we're probably going to end up running those simulations ourselves rather than getting a feed. The feed is actually quite large. Rather than getting a feed for those predictions, they're run several times a day right now. We hope to actually be able to run those simulations ourselves and be able to potentially run even more than 12 forecasts and be able to give much more detailed probability distributions for what will happen for weather in the future. I think it'll be kind of interesting, actually. I don't know what there's sort of a visualization problem. How do you present 12 weather forecasts or whatever else rather than just one? But that's sort of an interesting thing. But when you ask, I mean, I don't know why we're particularly talking about weather. We could pick a zillion different areas here. Yes, every one of these areas is quite complicated. Every one of these areas has quite a bit of depth, quite a lot of stuff to figure out. I think the main thing that we've discovered is there's great economy of scale to trying to do everything. If we just picked one area, we would have to build all kinds of systems for validating things, for sort of being systematic about things, which we just built for that one area. But we've built these pretty strong systems that just can be applied to all these different areas. Now, having said that, one of the things that is just a continual source of frustration, to me at least, is that you might think after you've done 1,000 domains that the 1,001st domain would not have any new issues, that it would just be plain sailing, that we know exactly what to do. It's never the case. There's just no domain. Maybe Jean can remember one recently where we just convinced.
That is ever the same, that we're always encountering new issues with each thing. It's amazing.
Right. I mean, I don't know what. Let's take. I don't know. We were talking about gas prices. Okay, so there's the U.S. gas price. What's one that we've done recently, which should have been plain sailing, Jean? What's that?
Alan, one of yours.
What about housing prices in?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Relocation. I don't know why we're picking on Bloomington, Illinois, but let's go ahead and do that.
The data out there is incomparable, and try to match. So a lot of the data is based on cities. Some of it's based on metropolitan areas. Some of it's based on counties. And how do you mix and match all of that stuff? It's a little bit tricky,
So this is actually, so it's interesting. Bloomington, Illinois doesn't have a very long time series for history of so let's see. So this is showing the sale price, how it's changed. Okay, there's the distribution of house prices, current estimated value distribution. So here's another tricky thing. There are 2 different sources of house price data. One of them is the National Association of Realtors. National Realtor Association, NRA, I think, which produces data on a weekly basis, I think, about the actual prices for which houses are sold. But then there's a completely different data set that is based on some community survey of owner-occupied homes that gives the value of the homes. And there's yet another data set which is not well aggregated, which is assessment data for tax purposes. And so, you have to try and unscramble these things and worry about which one is which one comes from where. I mean, it's interesting to see. I'm just going to show, since we're picking on Bloomington, Illinois. Yeah. So I mean, we'll see here. There's different populations: city, urban area, metro. You can ask to show history. Let's see how much of that we have here. Okay, this has become that's showing, in this particular case, city and metro area population. There's a time series going back about a decade for that. And if we go down here, okay, there's cost of living index is 0.97 times the national average, and tax rates and things, population density, and then, okay, this is an interesting thing. So this is what cities are nearby to Bloomington, Illinois. So we have to have some heuristic for deciding when you go further out, you care about, Chicago is near Bloomington, Illinois, and that's a useful thing to say, that Normal is near, that Peoria is near. Those, there's some heuristic that's based on sort of distance versus population and so on. If we go ahead and press more here, we should get some more cities. Okay, we just learned that Champaign is 46 miles east-southeast of Bloomington, Illinois. And it's decided to show us a few more cities here, and it's telling us now about St. Louis and Indianapolis and so on. And down here, okay, so this is always fun. Those are some people who are in our database. It claims that the most famous person born in Bloomington, Illinois, was George Rockwell, who's a person I have to admit I don't think I've ever heard of. But okay, Davison, I've heard of him. He's a physicist who discovered something about neutron scattering, I think. Anyway, so I don't know why I'm showing this, but it's kind of fun. Let's see, but yeah, so every different area, there's lots of depth that you have to dive into, and that's it's a fun project. It's and takes takes lots of effort, we keep on thinking, my gosh, there must be some way to automate all of this. There must be some magic scheme where we could just use natural language processing and machine learning and so on and get rid of all the humans in the loop. But, we use every fancy method we can think of, and I think we know all the fancy methods, and still the humans are pretty important in the loop.
Well, it's time to finish the panel. Let's thank all the panelists for the nice presentation and discussion.
And I have to say one more thing.
Yeah.
I have to say one more thing. I just for fun here, I've decided I'm a believer in using new technology, and so I've been, as I said, a remote CEO for many years. Well, I've been threatening for years to have a telepresence robot that can just wander around the company and come and sort of check on what's going on here. So I thought since this is a conference about something historical, I thought I would have fun and borrow a telepresence robot and come and join you at this reception in robotic form. So I haven't seen the other end of this. So this may be very, very weird. So I apologize for that. But we'll see what happens and hope have a chance to chat with some people in that form. Let's see if I can start the thing.
We'll see you across the hall in a few minutes, Stephen.
Yes, great.
Thanks, Stephen, for joining us.